Haha, Jerry. Very funny. Okay, here is what we are going to be building. A dining table base with 4 bent lamination arches. Possibly one of my most challenging projects ever. The first step was to start cutting down some plywood to make the bending forms for the arches. First, I marked the center point on one piece of plywood 3 inches up from the bottom. You'll see why in a minute. And then I made this little paper template, so I'll tape that on and use a little CA glue to glue down this little pivot point. Then I can screw on the trammel onto my router. When I put it on that pin, you can see I get a perfect circle, or half circle in this case. So I need to make 2 passes. The first is the inside pass, and then I'm going to move the router out to a second position to make the outer pass. The flashing orange arrow on the left indicates that I'm stopping my router short of going all the way because I need that last 3 inches to be straight and not a continuation of the circle. On the bandsaw, I can remove that waste from the middle. Then with a little CA glue, I'll put a block on there so I can actually get a nice flush and straight edge, and you'll see a little later why I need to do that. But using a flush trim bit, I'll clean up this first template, and that becomes my master. Yes, master. And then I can use that master to trace onto another piece of plywood, which I can screw together very rapidly so I can rough out multiple templates simultaneously. I do this on the bandsaw, which makes pretty quick work of this task. It gets a little heavy, got to clamp it together so they don't fall apart on me and fall onto the floor and my foot. And then one by one, I'm taking my master template and screwing it to one of my roughed out templates and flush trimming them all to the same size. Now in hindsight, I could have probably done 2 at once, but that would have saved me half the time, so why would I do that? I do the same thing to the outer part of the template. And then I glue the whole thing together into a giant stack of plywood goodness. So 7 pieces of plywood stacked together gives us roughly 5 1/4 inches. And as you can see, I ended up making 2 full forms for this project. And now I could begin the long and arduous process of resawing roughly 48 thin strips of walnut. My boards are just over 5 inches wide, so even with a good resaw setup, it just takes a long time. I'm ripping these to just under 3/16 of an inch, which gives me a little bit of room to plane them down to get me to my final thickness of 1/8 of an inch. So after each piece is resawn, then I take the original board over to the joiner to clean up that sawn face, and then back to the bandsaw to rip another strip. Put it to the side, and here's a sampling of what comes off the bandsaw. Now, since I do not have a drum sander, which would be the ideal tool for this task, I have to run them through my planer. You can see that piece of plywood, which acts as kind of an auxiliary booster seat, because my planer maxes out at about 1/4 of an inch thickness. So what this does, it allows me to get even thinner with my pieces. Unfortunately, when you go this thin on a planer, you're very likely to catch an edge and it will pull that board up and turn it into mulch for you. So the moral of the story, be careful and have some extra pieces in case a few get ruined. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Click that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of my future projects. So next I took some 6-inch PVC to basically make a dunk tank for these strips to let them soak a little bit and become more pliable. Some may say this step isn't necessary, but when I'm dealing with a tight radius like this and all those hours of resawing this expensive walnut, yeah, I'm going to give it every opportunity I can to bend for me without cracking. And while those were soaking, I decided I missed resawing on the bandsaw so much that I figured I would start on the center post of the dining table. Now, you could make this center post out of solid walnut, but I decided to use plywood and then skin it with walnut for a couple reasons. I had some scrap plywood around that I wanted to use up, and the walnut I had for this project was kind of limited, so I didn't want to waste it all on a center post that you wouldn't really see much of. And I just ended a sentence with a preposition, which is really going to disappoint my 8th grade grammar teacher. And if you're wondering why I used a router to run a chamfer down the edges, that just allows a little bit of a spillover canal for any excess glue to pool in the corners. And with everything glued, dried, and out of the 400 clamps, I could flush up the corners. As you can see here, I had a few little gaps right there. So what I do is I work up a little sawdust, use some translucent wood glue, and then with the sawdust make a little slurry, push it into that little gap, and just like that, it's gone. Adios, Senor Gapo. Then at the joiner planer, I squared it up and got it to the exact thickness and width of 5.5 by 5.5 inches square. And I squared up one end, and there's your center post. Ain't she swell? Okay, let's move on to the top and bottom sections of the dining table. As you can see, the orange arrows. Had to mill up a little bit of walnut for these to 1.5 inches thick. I'm using half-lap joints, which creates a nice and strong and robust joint for the top and bottom of this table. I cut these things to length. Oh boy. This one I had to glue up 2 individual pieces, and I didn't mark where the domino was, so we're going to have to do a little fix. Clean out any kind of waste, and then I cut another little piece of end grain to match it as close as I can. Little glue. Tap, tap, taparoo. I let that dry fully, and then using a flush cut saw, flush trim saw, whatever you want to call it, trim off most of the excess. Use a little block plane to kind of get down a little bit closer. Little sandpaper. Little hand wipe. Little mineral spirits. And it's pretty much good as new. I mean, it's not bad. And now we can finally assemble these. Now the screws are actually just acting as clamps right now because they will be removed later, and then I will screw through the bottom into the center post. So they're basically pilot holes / clamps. And now what seems like is a fairly routine operation of routing a cove profile is really not. You can see that piece of plywood I have there, which is acting as a stop block. So this is basically a stopped profile where they meet in the corner. It's actually a pretty delicate operation. You can see where the corner of that post sits right where the 2 profiles meet. Now if I just kept going around with the router instead, this is what would happen. It would overhang, it would just look horrible, and you could continue that profile up the center post, but number 1, that's not the design, and number 2, you would eat right through that walnut skin into the plywood core. Now I could work on making these little 1/2 inch kind of applique feet that will go on the bottom of the table. Basically just adds a nice little detail. It raises the base up just a little bit. This was kind of an afterthought. I wish I had thought of it before so I could get the grain a little bit better of a match, but it worked out fine. So I glued these on and then using a flush trim bit, got all the excess off and then just kind of sanded everything flush. You can see that little cove detail I put on there, which matches the cove on the base. Now, I know it seems like these strips were soaking forever, but they were really only in there for about an hour. It's just the way the filming looks here. So, wiped off all the excess water, and then using a bending form, I am pre-bending these strips, which some will say is not necessary either, but I like to do it because I want this walnut to know, hey, you're going to be bent and glued, so get used to it. Here's a little warm-up. And these Irwin quick grip clamps are a lifesaver for this operation. You can basically just steer that thing in and line it up perfectly. Now, I don't have the cork liner in this form yet, which you will see later, which is why it doesn't fit perfectly, and I'm using a clamp at the bottom to kind of squeeze everything together. And the next morning, I could take it out of the form when everything is pretty much dried. And look at that! They're bent-ish. So to finish up the form, what I'm doing is screwing down some rails. What this does is ensures that the male and the female form come together perfectly in alignment. Nice and smooth. Using some double-sided tape, I will apply the aforementioned cork to the form. What this does is it takes out any high and low spots or inconsistencies in the form, and then I cover it in packing tape to make sure that no glue will stick to it. Now, I am using Gorilla polyurethane glue to glue up these bent laminations. It gives me about 30 minutes of open time, which is plenty of time to spread and roll a nice, even, thin film thickness on each bent lamination. Now, if I were to use a PVA glue like Tite Bond, I just found that it cures way too fast, and it was about 80 degrees in my shop here, and everything was drying way too fast. And when you're dealing with an intense and stressful glue up like this, the last thing you want to have to worry about is the glue drying before your pieces are even in the clamps. I want to quickly point out that all pieces have a center line drawn on them, which ensures they all come together in alignment. So after each one was coated, I layered them up, slammed it down into the form, and then using those quick grip clamps, steered it home. It's definitely a little bit of a forearm workout here. Tried to make sure all pieces were relatively flush, even though at this point they were kind of stuck. But they were all made oversized, so we can fix that later. You can see I got a nice little bit of squeeze out there. And now we got to let this thing cook for 24 hours. And after that 24 hours, we can remove it from the form. And that was the release of 24 hours of nervous tension, because I honestly didn't know if I had some glue squeeze out and this thing was going to stick together or if nothing was going to stick, but it turned out pretty good for the first of 4. Made a couple passes on the joiner because I wanted to see what that edge looked like, and I was very happy. You can see a couple little gaps and spots there, but those will actually get removed when I rip this to width because they don't go all the way through. And another tip I picked up to prevent any glue squeeze out from sticking to the form is to coat everything in paste wax. It works really well. Oh look, that one's round too. Very nice. Clean this one up a little bit. So to trim the arches to width, I'm heading to the table saw. Now, some of you may think this is not a very safe operation, and it can get a little dicey, but I found as long as I go nice and slow and controlled, everything is fine. As you can see, as I'm coming through, I'm grabbing the top of the arch to help guide it past the blade. And you can see the featherboard kind of towards the bottom of the screen. I tried to use that, and it ended up just getting in the way and being more dangerous. I found this to be the safest and easiest way. Then take those saw marks out on the joiner. Okay, now I needed to trim the arches to their final length by cutting off the ends. Now you'll notice that the form I'm using here has no cork. That's because the final glue up was still in the form, and this was the pre-bending form. So I'm putting these little shims in here which represent the cork and give me the most accurate layout. So this has to be 29 inches. And shockingly, it's right on the money. So now I can transfer my cut line using a square. And you'll notice 2 lines on that form. One was the cut line that I just drew, and the other line is the actual center of the circle. But we want to make it an inch longer so I have a flat spot to attach to the top and bottom of the table. So clamping it to my crosscut sled makes easy work of these. And while I hunker down for a coffee break, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification bell to keep up with all of my tomfoolery. And now I can do a little dry fit and get everything clamped into place so I can mark and lay out for my dominoes, which will join each arch to the center post. Now, if you don't have a festool domino, you could use dowels, or if you wanted to, you could drive screws straight through the face of each arch into the post and then plug those holes. And once again, when using the domino, accurate layout is essential. And my buddy Nick Barboza over at NWB Wood gave me this little tip to just flatten out the area where it's going to make contact with the post, just so you have a little more glue surface area. And with a slightly firm hammer fist, that goes in nicely. Once all my dominoes were cut and my arches were dry fit in place, I could determine the final height of the center post, using a square from the center post and lined up with the top of each arch. And then it was back to the table saw to square off that end. Next, I needed to get the holes drilled that would house the recessed adjustable feet. I made this little template that slides over each foot and is easily clamped down, and then using my router, a guide bushing, and a spiral upcut bit, I can route out all the waste, and with the template, it ensures that every one of them is exactly the same. So that first hole that I did on the drill press was that hole for the threaded insert, and with that inserted, then the recessed foot recesses quite nicely. Now I could glue that center post in place. Couple of clamps just to kind of hold it in place, and then I flipped it over on the floor and then drive these 3-inch screws home with an impact driver and feel like a real man. Okay, that's a bit of a stretch. And next up, I could basically dry fit this whole thing together and get a little bit of satisfaction to see it coming together. And now I can drill the holes for the bolts and the threaded inserts. I'm going to countersink the top where the bolts will go. And then I can remove each arch and drill out 4 of the threaded inserts. I'm using Starbond CA glue on each threaded insert just to give it a little more bite into the wood. Kind of sand away any rough areas. And then a final test fit to make sure everything fits together and the bolts line up. Oh man, this thing just keeps going. Here I had to route out a little bit of a cove profile to match the profile on the foot. So I'm using a couple blocks on each end to prevent any tear out, and that looks nice. And then I'm going to plug the screws on the top. This isn't really necessary, but in the case that the client ever wants to put a glass top on this, it'll just look a little nicer. So flush trim those, sand them down. And now it was finally ready for final surface prep. I found a card scraper and this little hand sander. Made quick work of these arches. Well, quick is a relative term, really, when it comes to sanding. Also had to sand all of these cove profiles using a little edge profile sander. And then basically just go on a sanding spree on everything. Oh, and get a splinter along the way. Ow! And yet again, my favorite combination of Rubio Monocoat Pure and air-dried walnut. And my process is always the same. I'll sand up to 150, use a old hotel room card or driver's license or some kind of squeegee to spread the material around, use a white Scotch-Brite pad to work it in, and then either a microfiber cloth or a white clean rag to wipe off all the excess. And then I could glue and reassemble all the parts back together, and somehow I deleted all the footage of me clamping and gluing this thing, so here's just a little bolt action for you. And the final step was to actually drill out for these clear little rubber bumper standoffs. And with the grippiness of these bumpers and the weight of the granite top, there's no need to actually permanently screw through the base and into the top and risk cracking the granite. So you may have noticed during this build that, hey, wait a second, that doesn't look like the table he was building before. It looks kind of different. Well, that's because it is. This is version 2. Version 1, when it was delivered, was too tall. It was built to the customer specifications, but it was too tall. So had to redo the entire table, forms, everything. Between the 2 table bases, I have over 180 hours of time spent. So today is delivery day of the revised table base. And this should be the right size, and we can move on to the next project.